An American dies in Syria. He was fighting with the Islamic State. Game Faces, discussing football players and character building. Imitate Jesus. Pope Francis calls for forgiveness, not envy and greed. And illegal immigration, the impact on the ground. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, August 27, 2014. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. U.S. officials are learning more tonight about an American man killed in Syria while fighting alongside Islamic State militants. Wyatt Goolsbee reports from the White House tonight.
Brian, officials here at the White House say they are using every tool to try and stop or dissuade individuals from leaving the U.S. to join militants abroad. One of the big concerns has been Americans that have joined the terrorists will eventually, sooner or later, return home and launch attacks.
Family members of Douglas MacArthur McCain say they are devastated to learn the 33-year-old had joined the terrorist group, the Islamic State, in Syria. U.S. investigators had been watching the Minnesota native for some time. McCain converted to Islam 10 years ago and over the course of that time became radicalized. News that puzzles his relatives.
When I see him and I hear him speak and he sound like Somali or whatever, I didn't think that was really my cousin. You know, so that's why I said I felt like he may have lost his identity, because all of this is not him.
McCain's death comes as the U.S. is considering how best to respond more broadly to the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, who have overrun parts of Iraq and want to control the region. Today, Senator John McCain criticized the administration's military strategy.
If you think you can contain ISIS, do you really believe that? You can't contain ISIS. You have to defeat it. Look at the way that it's grown and morphed in just the last year or so. They have now attracted young people, young men from all over the world, and they are growing in strength.
The White House says the U.S. will confront ISIS, but also says they can't and won't do it unilaterally. They also say working with other countries will be critical in identifying Westerners like Douglas McCain who may still be carrying a passport.
We are working cooperatively with Interpol and other law enforcement agencies, as well as the Homeland Security agencies in countries throughout the West and in the region, to try to monitor the movements of these individuals and to mitigate the threat that they may face.
Officials here also say they believe there are now more than 100 other Americans who are fighting alongside jihadists in Syria right now, but that also doesn't include the thousands of other people from different foreign countries, up to 50 other countries that have gone to either Syria or Iraq to join extremist groups. Brian?
Wyatt Goolsbee at the White House tonight. Thank you. The Syrian government likely used chlorine gas on its own people. That is the verdict from an independent United Nations panel. The report was released today in Geneva. This is the first time the UN has specifically assigned blame for chemical weapons use in the Syrian civil war. The panel also says the Islamic State has committed crimes against humanity with its attacks on Syrian civilians. More than 190,000 people have been killed in 3 years of war. Now, some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. An American journalist who was held hostage in Syria for nearly 2 years is grateful to be home safe tonight. Peter Theo Curtis is finally in his Massachusetts home.
Total strangers have been coming up to me and saying, "Hey, we're just glad you're home. Welcome home. Glad you're back. Glad you're safe. Great to see you."
The 45-year-old American author and freelance reporter was released by Islamist militants in Syria this weekend. His emotional homecoming follows 22 months in captivity.
I had no idea when I was in prison. I had no idea that so much effort was being expended on my behalf.
The United Nations says Curtis was handed over Sunday to UN peacekeepers in the Golan Heights. 3 days later, he appeared in front of cameras. A former Army psychiatrist says that's a good sign for now.
What unfortunately we don't see often is what happens weeks and months and years later.
That's a good point.
And that's when the emotional turmoil begins.
Curtis's release could offer renewed hope for the family of Steven Sotloff, an American journalist held in Syria. Shirley Sotloff appealed directly to ISIS leaders in this videotaped statement.
Release my child As a mother, I ask your justice to be merciful and not punish my son for matters he has no control over.
A mother desperate to see her son live, while another is grateful to have her son back by her side.
I suddenly remember how good the American people are and what kindness they have in their hearts. And to all those people, I say a huge thank you from my heart, from the bottom of my heart.
It is good to see him home safe. Iraq's outgoing prime minister is accusing U.S. Vice President Joe Biden of interfering in Iraq's domestic affairs. Nouri al-Maliki is demanding that Biden respect the Iraqi constitution and help build unity in the country. Biden is calling for the formation of a new government in Iraq. He's encouraging opposition to the Islamic State militant group. The vice president called several Iraqi political leaders this week discussing possible military action against ISIS. Well, the fighting may be over in the Middle East, but the war of words continues tonight. A Palestinian legislator blames Israel for the war in Gaza, saying Hamas and the Palestinians acted only in self-defense. Meanwhile, an Israeli government spokesman says Israel will support reconstruction of Gaza.
We will support efforts to help the civilian population of the Gaza Strip, who we never saw as our enemy. What we won't support is the reconstruction of the Hamas terrorist military machine.
Israel and Hamas agreed to an open-ended ceasefire on Tuesday following a 7-week conflict. Dutch investigators say they've identified more than half the victims of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 through DNA samples. So far, 173 DNA samples have been positively identified. Efforts have been complicated by extra DNA found at the crash site, most likely from rebel forces who controlled the area around that wreckage for days. It's widely believed the pro-Russian separatists are responsible for shooting the jet down in July. Well, August is usually downtime in Italy. Many businesses, even Vatican offices, close as workers take vacations. Pope Francis is breaking tradition by staying on the job this month. The Holy Father held his General Wednesday audience in St. Peter's Square. Thousands turned out to see him, and he prayed with them, as he always does. He spoke about unity in the church.
Pensiamo a mancanze molto comuni nelle nostre comunità.
Francis addressed shortcomings in our own Christian community, sins like jealousy and envy. He stressed that Christians should welcome one another, forgive each other, and imitate Jesus. A court in the Dominican Republic has opened a case that could result in criminal charges against a former Vatican ambassador. A judge is investigating allegations against Joseph Wesolowski that he sexually molested boys in that Caribbean country. The Vatican recalled Wesolowski after the allegations emerged. He was later defrocked. That is the harshest sentence under church law, and the first time such a high-ranking Vatican official has been sanctioned for sex abuse. Wesolowski is appealing his case. The Archdiocese of Chicago says Cardinal Francis George's medical treatment will keep him from traveling to Rome this fall to meet with Pope Francis. The Cardinal had hoped to make the trip in mid-October. The 77-year-old is undergoing treatment for a recurrence of cancer near his kidney. He survived bladder cancer 8 years ago. Cardinal George has been the spiritual leader of Chicago's more than 2 billion Roman Catholics since 1997. He led the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops from 2007 to 2010. Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal is suing the Obama administration over the Common Core education standards. Jindal's lawsuit says the standards violate state sovereignty and control over education. The Federal Department of Education uses grant money and policy waivers to convince states to adopt the national standards. Jindal says it's illegal for the White House to use federal dollars to force states into accepting Common Core. Well, when people used to say they tinker with electronics, it meant maybe building a small radio, transistor radio. But now the sophistication that some people bring to these do-it-yourself projects is totally amazing. Our Catherine Elliott takes us to Hackers Haven in Arizona.
The ideas range from out of this world to just plain cool. Between a flower shop and a jewelry store, a group of techies sets up a community workplace called a hackerspace. Heatsink Labs, as it's called, is more like a clubhouse for inventors and the curious. Step inside, and like-minded tech wizards can be found tinkering and testing, or creating something that could change the world.
So the idea of thinking creatively and trying to solve your problems using the tools that you have in front of you, and really head first solving those problems, and then also like thinking outside of the box as well. Those are really the key traits of being a hacker and hacking something.
The number of hacker spaces around the world has grown to more than 1,600. HeatSync opened its doors in 2009, providing 24/7 access to its dues-paying members. It also allows the general public to experiment and engage at night.
Well, the first day I got here, there was a guy programming a quadruped, that's a four-legged robot, that had 2 webcams for eyes, and he was programming the algorithm to tell how far things were away from the robot. So that made me feel like, wow, there's advanced people here. I don't know if I fit in. But the people here were very welcoming, and they helped me to understand that this is a community, and if there's something you think you can do to help make it better, then you can do it.
Hackers of all levels are a part of the collaboration by either lending a hand or acting as a sounding board.
When you're surrounded by people who are always constantly making something, constantly trying to think outside the box and think of new ways to do something, improve on what's already been there, that infects you, and it's in a really nice, positive way.
The smattering of motherboards, computer chips, and copper strips, helping to create the environment where ideas can flourish and projects take off. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, illegal immigration isn't just a border issue, how your community is affected. And we discuss college football's new playoff system. On Wednesday, August 27th, thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. Border Patrol agents must now make sure immigrants living illegally in the U.S. are informed of their right to see a judge. That's the result of a lawsuit settlement between the government and the American Civil Liberties Union. The lawsuit alleges U.S. immigration officers in Southern California misled Mexican immigrants about their rights. That included telling migrants if they left the U.S., they would be allowed lawful status in the country. Authorities now have to give detailed written and oral information to immigrants about their rights. Government agencies also have to establish an information hotline detailing options. This was a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of 9 Mexican nationals and 3 immigration rights organizations. Well, the issue of illegal immigration, especially involving children, impacts all of America, not just border communities. Jason Calvi is with us tonight to explain.
Brian, U.S. Border Patrol says that since October, about 63,000 minors have crossed into the country without family. And today we're hearing from one New England mayor who's having to deal with the situation firsthand.
Judith Flanagan Kennedy is the mayor of Lynn, Mass. Population 90,000. Lynn is over 2,000 miles from the southern border, but feeling the heat of illegal immigration into the country.
I have refused to buy a new ladder truck for my fire department that's badly needed because that money had to get diverted over to the school department.
Kennedy says more than 500 unaccompanied youth who cross the border are now in her town, and they're costing the city millions and straining the city's resources.
We are going to be opening a new middle school in Lynn in 2016, and our projections show that it will already be overcrowded when it opens.
Jessica Vaughn with the Center for Immigration Studies says communities across the country will pay the price for these children.
Educational expenses, which can run about $10,000 per child, and also public health expenditures on vaccinations.
The Obama administration has ordered cases involving unaccompanied minors to be fast-tracked, meaning the kids will see an immigration judge sooner to determine if they should be deported or stay here.
I believe most of them are starting to come up for their initial hearings. It's really pretty much in the early stages at this point.
But the judges say the system is already beyond capacity.
I personally have over 2,400 pending cases. It takes about 15 months for the first arraignment type hearing.
And the judges say the current system needs an overhaul.
If your gas tank has a leak, do you just keep filling it up with gas, or do you fix the gas tank first? And that's what we definitely need to do. We need to fix the system so that we can retain judges, so that we can build the system up, so that we can respond to these types of crises in the future.
But one of the judges says she's concerned they could, in her words, have a tsunami of immigration judges retiring. They're calling for a doubling of new judges and want to be outside of direct control of the executive branch, Brian.
Jason, when you talked to the mayor of Lynn, Massachusetts, did she have any suggestions on how to deal with this surge?
She did, Brian. She said secure the borders. She said give us more money for the schools there in her district, and also was calling on other school districts to take care of some of the load here.
All right, Jason Calvi, thank you. The college football season begins tonight. The first game not going to generate a whole lot of excitement. Georgia State takes on Division I newcomer Abilene Christian. That's at the Georgia Dome. But over the rest of the holiday weekend, some bigger games that could have an impact on the new 14 playoff. Number 9 South Carolina hosts number 21 Texas A&M in SEC action on Thursday. Saturday in Texas, number 13 LSU plays 14th ranked Wisconsin. Then top-ranked Florida State, the defending national champion, takes on Oklahoma State. Former sportscaster Tony Burke, now Vice President of Communications for Catholic Charities here in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., joining us as we kick off college football season. Tony, we finally have playoffs.
Yep.
Explain how they work.
Well, you know, I think what they should have done is taken last year's BCS and combined it with this year's and taken the human element out of it. There's going to be people that sit in the room, very well-known people, Condoleezza Rice being one of them, that will ultimately determine who they think the best 4 teams in college football are, and they will play for the playoffs. And we will once again have the 5th and 6th and 7th teams going, wait a minute, what about us? I think the BCS, the way it was constructed, probably would have worked in this system because the computers would have taken the human element out of it. You'd have had the 4 power teams, and they would have played each other for the playoffs. So it's going to be very interesting to see.
Will we still have all the bowl games?
We will. Yeah, that'll be the first round of the playoffs to get everybody whittled down, and then they play for the title.
So in the high school level, we often see guys playing both ways, offense, defense. Now we're seeing that a little bit more on the college level. There's some problems with that, aren't there?
Well, you know, and with all the talk of the concussions and everything that we have now on every level of football, from Pee Wee on up to the NFL, yes. But it's not as prevalent as it used to be 30, 40 years ago. But it is a little more prevalent than it was. You'll see guys kick returns, punt returns that play defense or offense. You'll see a couple of guys go both ways on offense and defense. Usually it's the defensive back that can also play wide receiver, and they want the speed on the field. But there is a health concern there because in this day and age where there's so much attention paid to players getting hit in the head, concussions, headaches, you know, the more snaps you take, the more risk there is, obviously.
And the more tired you are, the more prone you are to injury.
Absolutely.
All right, so virtual reality used in high-tech training these days, is it affecting the performance on the field, do you think?
Well, I think it makes the players better. You know, anytime that you can do something and you don't have to be outside or you don't have to have a coach around or anything like that, they're using visuals for everything now. And they've found that this generation, they're much more visual. They don't want to be coached or taught. They want to see it. They want to see, okay, I screwed up on that play or I did this well. And that way they can learn from it. If there's it's in any sport, baseball, softball, if you got a hitch in your swing, you see it immediately and you can correct it. So I think virtual training's here to stay because there's so much you can do without having other people around to make yourself better. So, yes.
Finally, let's talk about building character in college football players. When Brian Kelly, who's at Notre Dame, was in Cincinnati, he had signs in the locker room one said, "Respect women." This is a big problem for these strong guys that are violent on the field. Often fall into that with their spouses, their girlfriends.
Yeah, and you know what? It's really a societal thing. It's not just football players, baseball players, athletes. You know, we're taught from the time we're little that you respect everyone, man, woman. It doesn't matter what it is. Respect, treat them with humanity. And I think it's wonderful to see the NFL, but also college football now educating the players on how to respect women, how to treat people, because it's not just for them at that point in their lives. Think about it when they go on to beyond football or beyond college. You've got to respect people in the workplace, people that you come in contact with every day. So I think anytime you can educate people, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I'm glad the NCAA is really coming on board with that.
Play hard, but always show respect. All right, with the communications for Catholic Charities here at the Archdiocese, Tony Burke, we always appreciate your good sports insight.
Thank you, Brian.
Up next, we visit Vinyl's Final Resting Place, a museum for those old record albums. And a sleepy student learns very little. We discuss sleep habits and school performance. We're grateful you could be with us on this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick on EWTN News Nightly. At an annual festival in eastern Spain, playing with your food is encouraged. About 22,000 people came to the Tomatina battle in the town of Bunal. 125 tons of very ripe tomatoes are used as ammunition. Today's event, the world's largest food fight, they call it, is the centerpiece of a week-long festival in the town. This battle originally began in the 1940s when some kids threw tomatoes on a crowd attending a carnival parade. Well, in this digital age, many of the world's iconic record stores have closed their doors. So where does all that vinyl go? Many classic LPs end up in Brazil, where a millionaire music enthusiast has built the world's largest record collection. Our Susie Pinto shows us.
Zero Freitas calls himself a hunter of lost sound. This is rare, he says. I'm taking this home. His obsession has made him the owner of the largest known record collection in the world. Everyone thinks I'm obsessed with albums, he says, but really it's an obsession with memory and history of Brazil and humankind. A Brazilian bus magnate who once studied music competition, Freitas has been collecting records his whole life. He owned 3,000 in high school and 30,000 by the time he was 30. Now he wants to make them available to the public, and he's taken on 17 interns to help him do it. They clean and dust, photograph the covers, and painstakingly catalog each one. About 500 records a day, he says. They've cataloged 250,000, a drop in the bucket. But Freitas hopes to open what he'll call a musical emporium next year, a kind of listening library. Most of the time, people are looking for something from their childhood, he says. Culturally irrelevant, but for that person, extremely important. What's his most important record? A signed album by Brazilian classical composer Heitor Villa-Lobos, and a rare recording of soprano Bidu Sayao bought for $1 on eBay. Susie Pinto, EWTN News Nightly.
Fascinating. Thank you, Susie. A new study was released earlier this week on students and sleep. Some pediatricians say middle and high school students should start the school day later so they'll be more rested and better able to learn. The American Academy of Pediatrics says school should start no earlier than 8:30 a.m. This would help reduce chronic sleep loss and improve overall health. Doctors say teens should get at least 8.5 hours of sleep, but some need even more. Joining us tonight is the lead author of the study, Dr. Judith Owens from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Owens, you say teens should start the school day later. Why not go to bed earlier?
Well, teens are biologically programmed to fall asleep at about 11 o'clock at night. And that's because during the transition to puberty, there is a natural shift in what's called our circadian rhythms, or body clock, which helps to regulate when we sleep and when we're awake. And so teens just simply can't fall asleep as early as they did when they were 9 or 10 years old, for example.
How interesting. So there's a scientific reason why teens must stay up late, right?
That's right.
So if you are sleep deprived, what can result from that?
There's a whole host of negative consequences, ranging from physical problems like an increased risk of obesity, higher rates of type 2 diabetes. There's also increases in mental health problems like depression and even suicidal thoughts. Safety concerns like more car accidents in teens who aren't well rested, and even higher rates of sports-related injuries for student athletes. School performance is also affected in terms of grades, standardized test performance, attendance, and even dropout rates.
So while we're all probably sleep deprived to some extent, it seems to be much more important with teens. Is there any way to substitute for less sleep with, say, caffeine or naps?
Well, on the caffeine side, I would say decidedly no. Caffeine does temporarily improve alertness, but the problem with it is that it then disrupts your nighttime sleep. And so you get into this vicious cycle of having sleep disruption, needing more caffeine the next day because you're even less alert, and so on and so on. Now, naps can be helpful if they're done strategically, which means short naps, 15 to 30 minutes, in the mid to late afternoon to kind of recharge your batteries. That's a reasonable short-term solution.
Probably good for all of us. From the American Academy of Pediatrics, Dr. Judith Owens, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again on YouTube. For all of us at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night, and God bless you.